Welcome to lesson 5 of the video lessons on the British Political History course. Starting this familiar warning, this is not going to cover the specific information which you must have in order to succeed in the exam. This is for the analysis, the stuff which is harder to get from the textbook. Use of the K-Drive reading or your textbook to get specific information to illustrate these arguments. So, the big question around the 1906 election is essentially, why was it a landslide? Why did the Liberals, after 26 years of electoral disaster, a pair of decades where the Conservatives have ruled supreme, what happened in order to switch it over? And because 1906 engenders another Liberal 20 years or so, and then the death of liberalism, as it were. So, in order to understand why people win elections, you cannot simply look at policies. There are no policies which intrinsically win you an election. Policies plus people wanting to hear those policies win you an election. Okay, plus a lot of how well you organise that message, how well your opponents have a different message, how well they attack your message, and how organised you are at getting that message out. The important thing to realise about the 1906 election is that this is an election where mass media doesn't really exist as a thing. There's not mass marketing programs, there's not obviously the internet, there's not TV, etc. So it's still a much more of a personal election, much more of a personal campaign, based around speakers going around town to town, based around machine politics, unions driving out the vote, employers driving out their vote, etc., etc. So to understand why 1906 happens, you really got to remember and consider the context of the time. So, number one, as a result, as we've seen, result of the changes in attitude towards poverty, there has been a general, but for different reasons amongst different groups. If you remember, national efficiency was a bit more of a right-wing idea. There's generally been a shift where people are becoming a little bit more sympathetic to the idea that in the case of poverty, we might see slightly more collectivism / state intervention. Collectivism is the idea that it's the duty of the state to help look after individuals, and the group society should help support each other. Individualism being the opposite, the idea of individuals should be responsible for themselves, etc. And only in some cases. So this is very important. Had the Liberals projected a new liberal platform in 1880, they would have lost, because people didn't want to hear those arguments about the idea of a small state providing contributorial insurance in order assisting people who are poor and also deserving. People don't want to hear that in the 1880s. In the 1900s, that is more of a viable argument. So you can say there's been a shift in the mentality of the electorate. As well as this, the Balfour government is weak and divided. People tend to focus on the weak, not the divided, but arguably the divided is more important. As always mentioned, and we'll mention again, the politics in this period is about turning out the vote. It's about being organised, about being on message. You cannot simply do mass politics from the centre. You need to get everyone on the same hymn sheet. If you are a fundamentally divided party, such as Conservatives are at this point, you cannot really as effectively organise a national response. Because you can't really send out certain speakers, because if you send out a speaker, if Balfour sends out a certain speaker, but this person is known as a free trader, the protectionists won't be happy, so they will refuse to accept him or demand Balfour doesn't send him. If he turns out to be, even if he's not going to talk about it, turns out to be a protectionist, the free traders will refuse. So essentially it becomes a lot more administratively difficult to run an election if everyone hates each other. Okay, and this is an election series where you can't just simply pay for an advert and then people will see your message. You've got to send people out, you've got to organise flyers, you've got to deliver stuff, you've got to deliver your local constituency parties, knocking on doors. So, because of the Balfour government's actions, particularly the Boer War and a couple of other little ones, and also the big thing, the tariff reform, unlike the Conservatives, the Liberals are more unified than they've ever been before. Well, never been in the last 20 years. They have been given issues which they can all agree on. So, obvious one being free trade. By the Conservatives starting a free trade debate, the one thing which unites all the different Liberal factions, from the businessmen to the Victorian moralists to the upper working class artisan to the Quakers etc., 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 is this idea of free trade. So as soon as the Conservatives start talking about free trade, Liberals are able to unify. And this is, for the exact same reason I've just mentioned, a unified party is far more on message, far more consistent, and campaigns far more effectively. Okay, so again, that's helped as an indirect effect of Balfour's government. And as well as this, new liberalism has been created, arguably for ideological reasons, but particularly in how it's been manifested in David Lloyd George and Churchill. So essentially David Lloyd George and Churchill have taken and cherry-picked the parts of new liberalism which what helps them politically, has been designed to protect against the liberals' left flank. What that means is there is a rise in working class sentiment, there's a rise in working class political sentiment in particular, and working class people are starting to organise. We see the LRC formed in 1900. Okay, unions are starting to get a bit more uneasy about the fact that liberals don't seem to represent working men. So in order to show that liberals are actually a party of the working men, and therefore there's no need to do anything as crass as leave the liberals and join the Labour Party, they need to shift their policies to the left. And that's the logic behind new liberalism, where you essentially keep the working class, keep your left wing happy so they don't leave you, by shifting some of your policies. Obviously you can't go too far because then you'll annoy your right. Arguably one of the other points or aims of the new liberal policy is to completely stop the chance of a Labour Party or encourage Labour Party to join them. But in reality, most sensible politicians realise that's very unlikely. It's more likely that the best bet was to try and make sure the Labour Party didn't get many votes, and therefore it loses this image that it could be a potentially serious party, and then it will just fade into obscurity. So the political landscape at this point is naturally tilted, if you can see, towards the Liberals. Now this doesn't mean they will win. You can very easily lose elections you can win, a la 2016. But it is very important to understand that what the Liberals do and what the Tories don't do interact with this background. Okay, the Liberals have that unity default, which they then build upon in order to run a very good campaign. If they lack that fundamental unity, they wouldn't be able to make a effective political campaign. So that shows that actually under this background stuff matters. But on the other hand, simply being unified without then making a good, well-organised campaign doesn't actually win you an election. So you need a bit of both. So the background to this theory is like this is the most factual you're going to get. So the only reason I mention this is sometimes missed in some of the textbooks. One of the big criticisms of Balfour, if you want to show off, one of two obvious ones. The obvious one everyone does is he does not do good things in government, therefore people don't like him, therefore they vote for Liberals. And as he mentioned in the Balfour government, that's technically true but very limited. The next level thing people mention, which is a nice and smug and nice and very good to do, is actually Balfour and the Conservative government's mismanaging the tariff crisis, which arguably isn't Balfour's fault, it's more Joseph Chamberlain's fault, leads to division, etc., etc., etc. You can also argue, not as its own paragraph, but as a point within any arguments about the role of Balfour, is Balfour actually makes 1906 happen. The election cycle is every 7 years. The last election was in 1900. So therefore they don't need an election in January 1906. Okay? But Balfour miscalculates. In December 1905, he realises that his government is split, it's weakened, he can't get anything from Parliament, because by this point, the one side of the Conservative Party are just rejecting any bills going for Parliament, which are made by the other side. So it's basically trench warfare. So what he decides to do is he decides that the Liberals have one great tradition, or two great traditions. One is laissez-faire approach to individualism, and the second is merciless internecine splits. So what he decides to do is he resigns, which then puts the next biggest party in power, which is obviously the Liberals. And what he hopes is they are a minority government, they won't have enough power to get stuff done, and they will naturally split over those radicals who want there to be massive change and the realists who say, guys, there's literally no way we can do this because we don't have a majority in Parliament. In reality, Henry Campbell Bannerman's party, that's the Liberals, because of the slow realization that 26 years of not being in government makes you realize that actually some things are more important than others, and because of the Tory attacks on stuff like religious non-conformity, on education policy, on liquor licensing, and most importantly free trade, the Liberal Party is actually far more united than it's ever been for a generation. So what this means is, and new liberalism, they can say, what this means is they don't split. And so what Campbell Bannerman says is, he does lots of nice speeches, looks very, very prime ministerial, and then says, and now we're a minority government, but we therefore want to prove that we are worthy. Let's go to the polls in 1906, and therefore the election is called for January 1906. Balfour completely miscalculates. By Balfour giving in the prime ministership, he does not look prime ministerial. He does not look like he's in control. Campbell Bannerman strides in, despite having a minority government, has a lot of very high-sounding rhetoric, doesn't make any policies, but he doesn't need to, and that can only be a bonus if you think about it. He looks all very prime ministerial, very august, does all the sort of shaking the hands, and then calls an election. So naturally now, you've got this party who gave up on power, and this party who looks like they're sensible for power, but all they need is a couple of more seats so they can prove themselves. So naturally, that sort of helps them. So, the first thing to question is actually whether there was even a Liberal landslide in this subsequent election. So on the left is the votes in the 1900 election, the previous election. So as you can see, the gap between the Tories and Liberals in terms of the number of votes is actually very, very small compared to the ratio of MPs. On the right is a map of the electoral district and who voted what in 1906. So what do we see from this? Well, in reality, in 1900, part of the reason the Conservative Party gets so many is 163 of those seats that they run in are uncontested. What this means is you can get 12 votes and you still win. Okay, it seems very weird where every election is contested nowadays, but in these days, because running elections was quite difficult and also, more importantly, very expensive, many parties didn't bother contesting areas where they think they would have lost anyway. So while that means that they haven't got, the Tories probably would have won at least 100 of those 163 seats without much effort, the fact still that there was uncontested seats due to Liberal disorganisation and Liberal poverty meant that the Tories had a much easier time of it. That completely changes in the 1906 election when the opposite is true, where the Liberals contest every possible seat, or, as we shall see in the next video lesson, agree with Labour that they will contest it instead. Okay? If you contest every seat, the Tories have to contest every seat. Then the Tories have to split up their money in their organisation to contest every seat. Therefore, they're less likely to do it effectively. So the first big thing we can see is actually, well, the Liberals are, rather than focusing on core areas, they are decided deliberately contesting as many seats as possible. This will mean they have more chance of winning, but also divides up the Conservatives. If we have a look at the overall votes, in terms of the swing of the vote, it's big but not huge, 5.4%, okay, with a much higher turnout, okay, so 8% to 8.1% turnout is significantly higher, which shows that people have been really infused by this election. But the swing itself, 5.4, is not huge. It hasn't made many people believe that they love the Liberals, etc. There is a core enough swing, okay, to the Liberals, which then delivers the Liberal vote, okay. There's not a huge landslide in terms of popular support, but this is the first past the post system. Now you have, I'm sure, have had this explained to you at length, so I'm not going to bother. Apart from to summarise the idea that it is not in the first past the post about getting necessarily the most votes nationwide. It's about getting the votes of the right people in a constituency. Now, some constituencies are naturally Liberal because they've got lots of people who will be Liberal, so you don't have to worry about it. Some of them are naturally Labour, some of them are naturally Conservative. But most constituencies have some Labour, some Conservatives, some Liberals. So what can weaken the Liberals is, number one, if 20% of people 25% of people vote for the Liberals, 25% of people who are also left-wing vote for Labour, 40% of people vote for the Tories, and 10% others. The Liberals and Labour represent 50% of the vote. They are the left-wing Progressive Party. However, because they have been split, if you look at who's got the most votes, it's the Tories. Yeah, so you've got 50% of that whole constituency is left-wing. But because half are voted for Liberals and half voted Labour, the Liberal candidates only got 25% of the vote. The Labour candidates only got 25% of the vote. Whereas the Tories have 40%, so the Tories win the seat. So the first thing is you must avoid splitting the vote, hence the Liberal Pact, as we shall see. The other thing is, if you've got, in every constituency, you've got hardcore Labour, hardcore Conservative, hardcore Liberal. But you've also got swing voters. Swing voters tend to be gravitating in this era. It's a bit different nowadays, but in this era, swing voters tend to be more middle class and still a little bit more well-to-do. But there is, again, a strong conservatism in certain areas amongst the working class, upper working class artisans. So, for example, if you look at Liverpool, that is a urban proletarian cluster of blue, and that actually only continues. Liverpool being a working class conservative area all the way up until 1945, Clement Attlee. Because of this, these people are swing voters. So actually, you are not going to convince the hardcore Tory to vote for Liberals. But if you convince a couple, 5 to 10% of these swing people who in 1910, so say that you've got default 20% of each party in the constituency, and this 10%, then if they join the Liberals now have 30%, or if they join the Conservatives now have 30%. What that means is they win. These 10% are who you want to impress. And you can argue what the Liberal landslide really is a result of is that moderate but still progressive tone persuading the middle-class swing voters in many constituencies to shift their allegiance from Balfour to the Liberal Party. So what we're looking to explain is not so much about how the masses were convinced by new liberalism, now masses were convinced by campaigning, but how the swing voters, that 10-15% of people who will change their mind, to have their mind changed. And very often free trade is just as important, and the failure of the Boer War is just as important as anything about reforming for the poor. So what we're trying to point out here, in a very laboured, complex way, is the idea that this is not an electoral landslide, i.e. we don't have 60 to 70% of people voting for Liberals. Okay? But what we do have is an electoral landslide. So although the Liberals only gain a 5.4% swing, they get around 59.25% of all seats. Conservatives get 23%. That's flipping what was in 1900 and making it worse. So how do you explain that? Well, you can explain it by the fact that now there's no competition between Liberal and Labour in most seats in this election. You can explain it that the Tories are bogged down and have to fight far more seats and therefore far more likely to lose them. You can explain it as the middle classes and the swing voters being persuaded to go over. Okay, this is not a fundamental change in society. This is a moderate shift of the swing voters, which therefore shifts the political centre of gravity. So therefore, what we're looking to explain here is what forces help get out the vote of the party faithful. Because if you don't get the sort of like the people who love Liberals out, then you're not going to balance the people who hate Liberals and love the Conservatives. But also, how does it, compared to the Conservatives, how do the Liberals persuade the swing voters who could vote either way to vote for their party? Okay, so what we're focusing on here is what is it the Tories do wrong and the Liberal Party do right in order to mobilise the swing voters. Okay, we're going to focus on the splitting vote Liberal Pact in the next lesson because it's got its own little thing. So, do not dare, to the answer of the question, why Liberals win, tell me that it is because of the Liberals becoming more popular. Because that's rubbish. I mean, popular is a relative term. Nothing is intrinsically popular. Now, if you're going to just go on that line, you can say they have a well-organised series of policies. Okay, so they have a series of policies which, considering the social and economic changes at the time, are increasingly popular. So we now made it even more complicated. And they are presented well, and they are not nullified by the opposition. Yeah, that is better. You have 4 different criteria in which leads to Liberals winning than simply saying not popular. Okay, so again, that idea, like, you cannot simply say, oh yeah, they're more popular, so people vote for them. Nothing, no policies are intrinsically popular. The socio-economic situation at the time, the changes in society, makes certain ideas more or less popular. Yeah. So as society changes, you can argue, and as society economically weakens, ideas around immigration in England have increasingly become a little bit more hostile. Okay, whereas that wasn't necessarily as much the case earlier, okay, in the early 2000s. Okay, so what we're trying to point out here is, okay, if it's not they have good policies that people like, what is it? People want, something has happened to society which means people want to hear the Liberal ideas. It's tick 1. Number 2, the Liberals have good ideas. Tick 2. Okay, the Conservatives, the Liberals have good ideas. That's number 2. Number 3, the Liberals present those ideas in a way, and they get those ideas to the masses in a very effective way. They are well organised. Number 4, the Conservatives are not an attractive choice of government. Tick, not an attractive choice. And number 5, and they do not present their case very well to win the election. These are the elements of a failed election campaign. Okay, Conservative. So you have the society, you have the party that wins ideological strength and organisational strengths, and then you have the party that loses ideological failures and organisational failures. So there are on the screen there's these sort of headlines, these core ideas, which you can say help them win elections. So what we're going to do is just going to go through them in a little bit more detail and explain how they might help the Liberal Party win in 1906. So let's focus on the Conservative errors, because elections are not just won, they are lost. That's a very profound thing. I'm pretty sure I've stolen that. Essentially, yes, as good as Liberals are, if their opponents are better, it doesn't matter. So you've always got to consider the failures of the Balfour government. Now, these failures are into 2 broad, simplistic categories which don't quite fit nicely, but they, let's just use them. Number 1, ideological failures and ideological legacy. I.e., the Balfour government was not popular at this point. Arguably, and probably not as bad as many people will say, arguably the policies of the Balfour government causes a lot of problems, and arguably, even if it doesn't quite lead to loads of people voting for the Liberals from the Conservatives, it might persuade many of the swing voters to go to Liberals. Okay, but more than that, the key thing, I think, focusing on this idea of, by discussing certain issues, licensing, education, and most importantly free trade, it does lead to, particularly the issue of free trade, to election by war, it does lead to more people considering going from the Conservatives to the Liberals over those particular issues. So these people don't love liberalism, they haven't been convinced by new liberalism, they don't like the idea of liberalism, but they have been convinced that the Tory party has lost its way on this issue, and therefore, because, for example, free trade matters so important, so much to them, okay, they will be prepared to suspend their party loyalty in this election for this case. You can also argue that, and this is the big thing we mentioned about Balfour's government, the failure of Balfour's government wasn't necessarily the individual policies. It was the fact that there was constant scandals, constant attacks, and no real changes, and no real sense that he was in control. His government, therefore, looks tired, looks weak, and looks incompetent. The Liberals, comparatively, as we shall see, present a very brash, very organised, and very confident approach. And very often, elections are decided by these sort of weird gut instincts of, the government is losing its way, so let's vote for someone else. Okay, so the Balfour government does not have an impressive score sheet of everything it's managed to do in the last couple of years, and so therefore it goes into the election at a disadvantage. Because in people's mindset, in their mind's eye, when they think of Balfour, they think failure. Even if they don't hate him for particular issues, there's nothing good for them to remember when they talk about him, when they think about him. Compare that to Liberals who've got a slick campaign and good slogans. And again, the other one is, I think, just as important, if not more important. Elections in this period, I cannot emphasise this enough, are about the ability to organise. It's the ability to organise your local parties in order to get the vote out. It's the ability to knock on doors and spread the information. The information, the only way to get it is speeches, knocking on doors and flyers handed out. You need a huge national operation. On top of this, you need, if you're going to have a national operation, a consistent, clear, focus grouped message. A message that you know works, that's the same everywhere, and therefore has real strength. Okay, so that if you get a message on a flyer, it matches the message in the speech, which when the guy comes around in a couple of weeks' time, or the next guy comes in a couple of weeks' time. If everyone's saying different things, if the Locals Party is saying one thing, the leaflets are saying another thing, speaker number one is saying a different thing, speaker number two is saying a different thing, you don't get the sense that this party knows what it's doing, and you don't get a sense of what the party stands for. Therefore, you need a clearly organised, well-oiled, and ideologically coherent, i.e. everyone agrees what the party platform is, argument. Okay? The Conservatives do not have this. Because of the issue of free trade, the Tory party is fundamentally divided into different factions. Factions which are, at this point, in a state of near war. Because of this, number one, in many cases, the local party do not do what the central party want because they see them as opponents. They do not help the local neighbouring party who might be pro-free trade if they're anti-free trade. Okay? More than this, the Balfour government cannot push, and Balfour cannot force a party line on these issues, does not have much authority to ensure that everyone is arguing the same thing, because everyone doesn't listen to him, because no side respects him. And every side is suspicious that Balfour's on the other side. So instead what happens is there's no real central message. So the Tories go into election not really standing for anything. The only message they can agree on is they're going to attack what the Liberals are doing, which can work. And they say it costs too much. They say it's socialism sort of in hiding almost. But that only works up until a certain point. Politics of fear need to be combined with politics of opportunity, the politics of hope, in order to really succeed. But they can only push a fear-based campaign because they can't agree on what the hope part is. Does the hope part include protectionism or does it not? Okay, and so therefore they don't mention it. So it's just a negative campaign, but without really a more trustworthy alternative. Oh, we hate the Liberals, carry on with Balfour because he's done nothing at all. Okay. The next area of strength is the Liberals. Okay, so if the Conservatives lost the election, you can argue the Liberals won the election. Okay, you can say, and I would say this isn't so much Liberal strength, this is a sort of socio-economic thing, that shifts in society, arguably happening over the last 50 years, means that society is slowly becoming more progressive and more left-wing. This is because of the increasing working class vote, the increasing fear of socialism, and therefore people going, you know what, let's at least have some moderate social reform to stop socialism rising. The increased political organisation and consciousness of people like the mining unions and other groups who have political sway. And therefore, because of this, the Liberals are naturally more advantaged. Okay, if society is naturally becoming more liberal, then the Liberal Party is naturally helped by this. And you can argue that the new Liberal policies, new Liberal ideas, and we mentioned in a lot of detail about how new Liberal ideas help them win elections, so we're not going to go over that again, but essentially the new Liberal ideas fit that shift nicely. They produce a manifesto which is more progressive than anything the Balfour governments are doing, even though the Balfour government doesn't have any policies. But at the same time, it is not too radical. So therefore it really fits into that progressive sense amongst certain groups in society. It fits in even with those right-wingers who believe in national efficiency. So what we see is, although not everyone is convinced by new liberalism in any way, shape or form, enough people who previously were conservative but are having concerns about the rise of socialism, having concerns about national efficiency, or to a lesser extent concerns about the poor, will shift over on the basis of new liberalism. So what we're saying is, yes, it's the ideology, but it's the ideology plus the environment in which England is in the 1900s or 1906. If the new liberalism had come in 1880, it would not have worked because people didn't care about it, they didn't want to hear it, they didn't believe in the change. Okay. Number two, the liberal message, the liberal ideology was much better. Okay, They played on the weakness on the Conservatives' tariffs. They mentioned tariffs in every way, shape or form to show what they stood for. They really pushed these different special interests, not because these special interests were particularly good at getting moderate swing voters. The average middle class swing voter does not care about the poor Chinese labourers being forced into these colonies in southern Africa. But it does make people who the sort of 5 and 10% of society who do care about that really angry, and therefore really keen to turn out. And the most important thing to realise about elections is that turnout is one of the most important things. If you don't get your vote out, it doesn't matter if they're your supporters; they don't count. So by pushing these tariff issues, Chinese slavery and education issues, they make sure everyone who's got the remotest sympathy for the Liberals will vote and go out and vote. And that's a really important thing. Like, that's not necessarily the case. Some people are lazy, some people go, I'll be fine. Some people are like, I like the Liberals, but I can't be bothered to go and vote. So they don't turn out and vote, it doesn't make a difference. There's a huge thing, for example, in America, where ethnic minorities vote in presidential but don't vote in midterms. This is where you see that although there's lots of Democratic supporting ethnic minorities by and large, the presidential elections always get a bit of a boost because of that, because there's more Democrats coming out. But in the midterms, these ethnic minorities don't turn up, essentially, or at least in the same numbers, and therefore the Democrats always lose midterms as a result. Well, not always, but they'd always do worse on it to some extent. So the idea of, by having a message which focuses, particularly the idea of free trade, on capturing certain groups who are loyal to the Conservatives, and, this is an important distinction, and at the same time ensures their faithful come out and vote, so they transfer people, but at the same time they also make sure their base comes out and votes, that helps maximise their votes. You must make that distinction. You cannot say they have a good policy and people like it. You must point out that certain policies are good at transferring, particularly free trade, Conservative sympathisers or swing voters over to Liberal cause, albeit temporarily, and at the same time pushing certain of the key Liberal touchstone issues, the Boer War, Chinese slavery, education, licensing, helps ensure that your base comes out to vote. And that's just as important, and no one's going to mention that. Finally, the Liberals were much more organised this time round in 1900. They contested far more seats, almost all of them. Okay, they used a much more dynamic and populist campaigning style, lots of posters. Because they were unified, they were able to send out speeches which are basically all saying the same thing, but in different fiery rhetoric ways. All around the UK, they were able to send out a message, and it was very clear to most people what the Liberals stood for and what they promised. It was less clear what the Conservatives promised and what they stood for. Okay. They were really pushing particularly the idea of tariff reform, the Liberal loaf being that very famous propaganda device to point out that under tariffs how much more expensive bread will get. So by organising, contesting and making alliances with the Labour Party, as we shall see next lesson, the Liberals are far more effective at running and fighting the elections. This is against, and you must always hold this in the same breath, of how weak the Conservatives are at this. If you have loads of great speakers, but the Conservatives have loads of great speakers, you having good speakers makes less of an effect than if you have loads of great speakers and the Conservatives send no one, which is kind of what happens in many towns. And I would say I'd finish this by saying that, well, I mean, we don't do specific facts in these things, and you'll need to look up this in more detail, but essentially, one of the most interesting results that comes from this election is it's more arguably of a rejection of Balfour than the Conservative ideology. Okay? It's a reaction against the leadership, it's a reaction against the division, rather than fundamentally people have been convinced to become Liberals. An interesting statistic, for example, although there's a 5.4% swing, that in Balfour's own constituency, Manchester East, the swing is 22%. Yeah, okay, which shows that clearly there's a real focus of hostile popular anger against Balfour himself. Okay, actually doesn't do too well in that election. So this arguably, you can say, therefore, is an landslide of the ability to translate a modest change in votes to a massive political landslide. Okay, the Liberals do not get a huge amount of votes. Okay, but they are able to translate that to far more seats than they were before. So you can say in some ways this is a political landslide, not a popular landslide. However, it is still fundamental, and actually all of politics, apart from a couple of weird elections such as 1951, are decided by small swings. You might have a small swing and then a huge, because there's so many swing voters, even if you swing 5 and 10% of these people, that might change hundreds and hundreds of seats, and therefore you get a huge majority. Okay? So, how do we explain this change? You cannot simply say people did not like Balfour, therefore they voted for Liberals. There is why people win elections is so much more complicated than that. It's about organisation, it's about the society at the time, it's about the weaknesses, the division, it's about how elections are run. You are not expected to have one cause. What you are often need to also consider is how much of these causes, the fact that the Balfour government muck up certain issues, or the fact that the Liberals are far more unified, are underpinned by the fact that actually long-term socioeconomic trends mean that Liberals are in a strong advantage and people naturally side on their belief, their ideas a little bit more. There is no over answer to the question, therefore, of why do they win. I would contend that some of the more significant factors include tariff reform, which both has the effect of dividing the Conservative Party, meaning that Balfour's authority is even further weakened, hurting their electability, and also giving a crucial rallying point for the Liberal Party, as well as helping them get many votes and sympathies from people who normally vote Conservatives. You must also say, though, however, the Liberals play that that advantage very well, being very well organised and having a good campaign. And you can say, particularly, underpinning all of this, is people want to hear at this point what the Liberals have to say. You can say this is a natural, if you believe in pendulum theory, there's the idea that after 20 or 30 years, people get very bored of their own political parties and they try and shift. You can say that because of long-term socioeconomic change, power is resting increasingly with progressive parties. However you want to put it, you can say there's a long-term change which then naturally helps boost this. That is a bit of a rush through. You need to make sure you find specific evidence to prove all these different things. What you need to hopefully have come away with this thinking is that you have a far more complex way of arguing why they win the election, as opposed to Balfour is bad and he makes people sad, and therefore the sad people don't vote for him, and therefore David Lloyd George will become person important, because that's not very good. Okay, I will see you in the next video after some coffee. And we shall move on to Lib Lab Pact, a mercifully short one.